And that concludes our public participation and takes us to item number 13, which are actions as necessary or appropriate on matters discussed in executive session. We had one item, which was selected employment item shown in Exhibit 3A. Do I have a motion? Mr. Cates.
I move that we give approval to selected employment items, Exhibit A, as presented in the executive session.
We have a second. Ms. Hammond seconds. Any discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor, please raise your hand. That passes unanimously. Takes us to item number 14, which is second and final reading approval of policy IC school year shown as Exhibit B. Do I have a motion? Ms. Hutchison.
I move that we give second and final reading approval of proposed revisions to Board Policy IC school year as shown in Exhibit B.
We have a second. Mr. Cates seconds. Any discussion? All those, seeing none, all those in favor, please raise your hand. That passes unanimously. Brings us to item number 15, which is second and final reading approval of the new policy IHBA-E, delegation of rights to make educational decisions, shown in Exhibit C. Do I have a motion? Mr. Cates.
Mr. Chairman, I move we give second and final reading approval of the proposed revisions to Board Policy IHBA, Special Education Programs for Disabled Students, and new policy IHBA-E, Delegation of Rights to Making Education Decisions, as presented in Exhibit C.
Thank you, Mr. Cates. We have a second. Mr. Lovelace seconds. We have any discussion? Mr. Lovelace.
This is a matter of, it looks like a typo maybe on the fourth paragraph. We changed the word every child to student highlighted in blue. And then in the next sentence it says, if a child, I think that should read student. Am I not correct there, since we changed it in one place?
We can certainly make that change, absolutely.
I just didn't want it to be confusing in the future. So.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lovelace. Any other discussion? Any other items? Seeing none, all those in favor, please raise your hand. And that passes unanimously. It brings us to item number 16, which is first reading approval of the proposed new board policy JFABF, students in foster care, shown in Exhibit D. Do I have a motion? Ms. Hutchison.
I move that we give first reading approval of proposed new Board Policy JFABF, students in foster care, shown in Exhibit D.
Have a second. Ms. Hammond seconds. Any discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor, please raise your hand. That passes unanimously. Brings us to item number 17, which is first reading approval of proposed revisions to Board Policy JH-R, student absences and excuses, shown in Exhibit E. I have a motion. Mr. Cates.
I move we give first reading approval of proposed revisions to Board Policy JH-R, student absences and excuses, as presented in Exhibit E.
We have a second. Ms. Hammond seconds. Having discussion?
I have one question.
Ms. Hammond?
Are there any major changes, Dr. Melton? Is it more of the state requirements about the number of absences and excuses, or is there any leeway with the individual district?
Thank you, Ms. Hammond. I'm actually going to defer that to Dr. Harris, but this is to make sure that we are in compliance with what the federal government expects and what the state of South Carolina expect. Dr. Harris, anything else you'd like to add to that beyond the compliance piece?
I think that really therein lies the response to that, Ms. Hammond. What's prescribed here is specific to what the state has suggested to us. So all districts throughout the state of South Carolina are following suit with what's here in this particular policy. So we're just aligning this policy with what's been suggested.
Mr. Lovelace.
It says here on the fourth paragraph, it says that if the student transfers to another public school in the state, wouldn't it be, of interest to our students to, in their best interest, no matter where they move, that we would try try to inform the school district if it were in another state? Or is that something that just state law requires us to limit ourselves just to the state of South Carolina?
I will respond to that, Mr. Lovelace, by saying this, is that attendance is a part of school records. So once school records are requested from, let's say, a school District 5, that's going to be a part of that student's record. So they would be apprised of that student's attendance at that particular time.
Okay, no matter if it were in the state of South Carolina or somewhere else?
Once records, whether it's in South Carolina itself or outside of South Carolina, when records are requested, attendance is a part of that, as like grades or anything else. And so the student or that particular school district will be apprised of that student's attendance at that time. Right.
Mr. Lovelace and Mr. Gann, if I may add, because we're trying to get things in compliance in South Carolina, our system is different slightly than other states, so we forward it, but it may not be as easily understood as what we would understand in South Carolina because of the compliance piece. Every state's a little bit unique because of their approval process with the Department of Education as well.
Mr. Keats.
Dr. Harris, thank you for adding the related school district policies at the end of that policy. That's a rather lengthy list, and I appreciate the effort that went into that, and I hope as we look at policies going forward that becomes kind of a standard practice that we can cross-reference for our parents to know where some of the other policies are that impact their students. So I appreciate the effort that went into that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Cates. And we just simply added everything that was related to attendance and excuses and made sure that was a part of it, not knowing the individual circumstances. Yeah.
Any other questions, comments? Seeing none, all those in favor, please raise your hand. And that passes unanimously. That brings us to item 18, which is first reading approval of proposed revisions to Board Policy JICG, tobacco use by students, shown in Exhibit F. Ms. Hutchison.
I move that we give first reading approval of proposed revisions to Board Policy JICG, tobacco-free students, as shown in Exhibit F. No.
Did I skip one? Okay. Mr. Cates, were you on the second?
Yes, but I think are you referring to, Ms. Hutchison, item 18 or item
No,
19?
If I can, have we got the second? Then I'll.
Yeah, I seconded.
Okay, so it's JICG, and if you'll look on the policy, we changed it. It used to be tobacco use by students, and Mr. Harris can talk about that. But it was something that I had brought up back when we first discussed this, and I suggested we had tobacco-free for workplace and schools, and I said that I would prefer to use tobacco-free for students instead of talking about tobacco use, because that implies something totally different. And so it just didn't make the change on our agenda, but I was trying to match the motion with what the policy is. Is that correct, Mr. Harris?
That is correct. What the agenda states is the original policy as it is. So
Oh.
I did not state the recommendation on the agenda because it had not been approved. That would be the only deviation to that.
But it's on what we're looking at. It's on the recommended.
I think
That is correct.
Mr. Gann.
Mr. Cates.
I think, if I understand what Mr. Harris, I understand
I
what you're
see,
saying.
I
but
gotcha.
Is once we adopt this policy,
It will be there.
then be referred to as tobacco-free students.
Okay, so I'm
JICG.
jumping the gun, huh? Okay. Well, I will amend that friendly amendment.
Friendly amendment to the.
Yeah, tobacco use by students. I was overly eager.
All right,
Thank you.
any other discussion? I will say, Ms. Hutchison, we appreciate your eagerness, because I remember that whole discussion, and tobacco-free is what our goal, not tobacco use. So
Right.
thank you very much. We enjoy your eagerness. So that brings us, no other discussion, to a vote. All those in favor, please raise your hand. And that passes unanimously. And Ms. Hutchinson, if you'd like to announce what that new policy that we just approved will be called.
I will be happy to. We
Please
have
do.
now the tobacco-free students, and I'm so
Right.
happy about that.
Very good.
Thank you.
We're in concurrence. That brings us to item 19, which is first reading approval of proposed revisions to Board Policy ADC tobacco-free workplace and school shown in Exhibit G. Mr. Cates.
Mr. Chairman, I move that we give first reading approval of proposed revisions to Board Policy ADC tobacco-free workplace and schools, Exhibit G.
Do we have a second? Ms. Gardner seconds. Any discussion? Ms. Hammond?
So, not to go back over Ms. Hutchinson's discussion, but in a sense, tobacco-free workplace and schools totally takes in that other one we voted on. You know what I'm saying? I mean, I don't have a problem with it, but I was just asking. Plus, I want to ask for teachers. I know they shouldn't, but if there are any teachers that smoke in the work, I mean, that have the habit of smoking, is there any, do they ever have a section that teachers, I'm talking about people that work, can they go somewhere and smoke? I'm just curious.
No, not at all, no
Not
ma'am.
anywhere-
Not at
I mean,
all.
not anywhere, say on any campus.
It is a tobacco-free school district.
Okay, because some districts, I mean, I just know this from some smokers I know in some districts, they'll have, not in the building, but they can smoke if they go off, if they have some area outside. And I just wondered if we have any requests from workers of that.
I'm not aware of any requests, but I would say that based on state law, school districts are tobacco-free.
Right, yeah, that's been going on a good while. Yeah, thank you. That's
And
my
I'm
question.
sure Mr. Harris will tell you, they can go to off-campus,
Yeah.
outside the
off-campus.
rail,
Right,
but
and-
can't do that during the school day and not be
That is correct.
sort of truant, right?
Right.
We're not going there.
There'd be a problem with that, that's
We're
correct.
talking about tobacco-free.
Free, I get you, I get you.
And I will have to say,
And it's a good thing.
we've all observed this. We see it at ball games and
Yeah.
other events. I've watched people smoke or use tobacco leaning up against a sign and a post that says, this is a
No.
tobacco-free facility. We got a long way to go to educate, but we're working on it.
That's
We're
right.
working on it. Mr. Cates?
Just to clarify, the policies differ in the fact that one's addressed towards
Just
student behavior and the other one is addressed
That is
towards the
correct.
workplace and in the district in a broader sense.
Yeah,
Workplace, to inclusive of all staff, vendors, contractors, so forth and so on, that's correct.
thank you.
Mr. Harris, you just mentioned a word I'd like to address. If we have vendors that come on site, they know our rules coming in about tobacco-free. So their excuse can't be, I don't work here.
That is correct.
I'm just working here. That doesn't fly in our
That does not
principals and
fly.
administrative.
That is correct.
That'd be a terrible example to set if otherwise. All right, any other discussion on item 19, Exhibit G? If seeing none, all those in favor of approval, please raise your hand. That passes unanimously. That brings us to item number 20, which is approval of the proposed calendar 2019-2020 shown in Exhibit H. Ms. Hutchison.
I move that we give approval of the proposed calendar 2019-2020 as shown in Exhibit H.
Have a second? Mr. Lovelace seconds. Do we have any discussion? See none. All those in favor, please raise your hand. And that passes unanimously. That brings us to item number 21, which is enrollment freeze Phase 2. And probably need a presentation, and then we'll have our motion in a second. I remind the board, we all had a handout for this, if you make sure you had it.
We can back it up one. There we go. Okay, there we go. All right, Mr. Chairman, members of the board, Superintendent Melton, executive staff, and community, we're here to talk about the plan for the implementation of an enrollment freeze, and we have dubbed this Phase 2. And before I proceed, I will indicate or remind, serve as a reminder that we did about a year ago implement, with your approval, a Phase 1 over at Lake Murray Elementary School, based on the enrollment that was ever increasing, and we moved forward about a year ago with the Phase 1, what we'll consider now Phase 1 of an enrollment freeze. And we've continued to monitor our enrollment in various schools, and tonight we found it necessary to give a presentation regarding a Phase 2. And what I think I'll begin with is by giving a definition that guided us on last year as it relates to Phase 1. We'll continue to use this definition on this year for Phase 2 in terms of identifying and defining what an enrollment freeze is. And we've determined and used as an operating definition that an enrollment freeze is an administrative action that impacts building capacity by redirecting an incoming student population from an overcrowded school or schools where there is available space. So we're redirecting or reassigning, if you will, incoming students into a particular attendance area. Again, this governed us on last year, and we want it to continue to govern us again this year. As we speak about Phase 1, and the next couple of slides will be in reference to Phase 1 to kind of give us some background related to that. This is a familiar slide that we've used previously this year, back when we did our 10-day enrollment. I've used the same format, but I've kind of updated it to give you an idea. Phase 1 began on last year during the 17-18 school year, January 22nd. It was the start of our second semester, January 22nd, 2018. And that particular time when we opted to move forward with the freeze at Lake Murray, we offered and made available 2 schools in which we would reassign students. Families would have the option of 2 schools in which to be reassigned: Ballantyne Elementary School and North Chapin Elementary School. And as you can see on the left side of the slide, it indicates from K through 5 the number of students who opted, or families, if you will, who opted to select Ballantyne Elementary School. To date, again, beginning January 22nd until the latter part of last week, there were 29 families or 29 students who have been impacted by the enrollment freeze and have opted to attend or be reassigned to Ballantyne. Whereas on the right side of the slide, you'll see that there are 114 students who have selected Chapin Elementary School, for a total of 143 students who have been impacted by Phase 1, as I'll continue to refer throughout this presentation, impacted by Phase 1 of the enrollment freeze. I want to also, as I talk about Lake Murray and its freeze, I want to give an idea, give a glimpse of that 143, say a word or two about that. And this map gives a bit of an indication as to where those 143 families have opted to choose their residence. Now, I'm going to see if I can make this. There we go. So I'm going to identify a couple of things. There are 3 stars. I'm going to use my pointer here for the community behind me. But there are 3 stars here. One here that indicates Ballantyne Elementary School and an approximation as to where it's located. There's a second here where Lake Murray, second star, where Lake Murray is approximately located. And then a third where Chapin Elementary School is approximately located. What we find is that the better part of the person's 143 families live and have resided consistent with their freeze, the Phase 1 of the freeze, resided in the Lake Murray attendance area. We know, according to mapping, that the Lake Murray attendance area is a pretty wide, broad range, or covers a lot of land mass. And what we believe is true here, and as we look at that, and the dots representing where they reside, what we believe is that families have opted overwhelmingly Chapin Elementary School, not only based on proximity, but also based on the fact that they have began a process of aligning their students or aligning their children with enrollment into the Chapin schools. In other words, we anticipate that they have aligned early on due to this reassignment with an opportunity to allow their students to continue to matriculate through Chapin Intermediate School, begin in 5th grade on to Chapin Middle, and then to Chapin High School. It's an opportunity for them to go ahead and begin to build relationships, to begin to learn staff and so forth, get involved in the extracurriculars that the Chapin schools offer. And we believe that they've intentionally identified these areas in which to begin that process. Ballantyne Elementary School, as we know, is not zoned or part of the Chapin cluster of schools. It is a part of the Dutch Fork cluster of schools, and therein lies, I think, the difference in the number of students or the number of families that have been redirected. So we wanted to make that as a point of emphasis regarding the mapping that we have here. So with that in mind, giving us some idea about Phase 1, moving on to a recommendation regarding Phase 2, who would be impacted by an enrollment freeze? And again, it would be new students, new residents who are zoned and currently zoned to attend Chapin Elementary School. So if they are new, moving into their Chapin Elementary attendance area, they would be impacted or reassigned, as we say, for this Phase 2 of an enrollment freeze there at Chapin Elementary School. How will it work? We'll continue to follow suit with what we've had in Phase 1. There are 3 points of emphasis that we raised. We'll raise those again very briefly on tonight, indicating that it would work this way. First, only students and families who move into the Chapin Elementary attendance zone after an agreed-upon date will be impacted by the freeze. Secondly, we have indicated and suggested, again, that all new students and families will be administratively reassigned, an operative word there, to a school with available space and capacity for additional students. Again, this follows suit with what we have in Phase 1 here at Lake Murray Elementary School. The next third portion of that, third wheel of that, how will it work, or how will the enrollment freeze work, is that optional transportation will be made available to and from Chapin Elementary School to and identify school or schools where space is currently existing. We want to continue in this vein because what we found in Phase 1 is that 57% of our families, that 143, opted to utilize district transportation to Chapin Elementary School and or to Ballantyne. So we want to continue in that regard as we look at Chapin Elementary for potentially a Phase 2 enrollment freeze. So where would District 5 students impacted by an enrollment freeze be reassigned? That becomes a question because we're looking at this point now based upon your approval, Chapin Elementary School combined with Lake Murray Elementary School in terms of both would be frozen. And the recommendations are such that those schools of choice, those transfer schools that would be made available would be Ballantyne Elementary School, Dutch Fork Elementary School, and River Springs Elementary School. Ballantyne Elementary School, of course, has been closed to school of choice as we know it. However, it is open and will continue to be open to the enrollment freeze. In 2016-17, we began a process of trying to offset some of the enrollment here at Lake Murray by offering a voluntary enrollment opportunity. So that would continue as well because there are siblings who are growing up from families who have opted for Ballantyne who are also interested in the younger siblings attending Ballantyne as well. So it will continue with the voluntary enrollment as well as the freeze itself. Dutch Fork Elementary School is one of our magnet schools and whole school models, and it will continue to be an environmental science magnet as well as being open to the freeze concept, this Phase 2. And then River Springs Elementary School currently has a 4K Excel program there. It has been and will continue to be open to school of choice, and it will also be open to the freeze concept as we know it. We'll continue to monitor enrollment because we don't know as looking at not only the school's enrollment, but looking at class sizes, looking at grade levels, and monitoring that appropriately and accordingly to make certain that if there's a need that we would come back to you with more information, perhaps a Phase 3, we're not sure of that, but as the need arises, we want to have that opportunity to come back to you to discuss that at that particular time. But we do believe offering more than one choice, more than two choices, but in this case, 3 choices for families is as family-friendly, and we'll certainly try to meet the need in light of the enrollment that we have there at Chapin Elementary. Again, when would the enrollment freeze begin? Again, our recommendation is on tonight that we would begin consistent with what we did on Phase 1 with a January 22nd, 2019 during the second semester start date. This recommendation is inclusive of the disclaimer, the note below, whereas that the recommendation does not include families who currently reside in the Chapin Elementary attendance area and or who have valid documentation of an approved contract prior to, this is a building contract, housing contract, prior to the January 22nd, 2019 date. So if there's a contract that's been signed and duly executed after the 22nd, they would in fact be impacted by the enrollment freeze. However, if it is prior to that, if it is January the 1st, or it was in December, they would not be impacted by the enrollment freeze. Again, consistent with what we've tried to do in previous years. We are prepared to communicate this to our public and provide the necessary press releases, provide social media information to acknowledge within the next few days, beginning tomorrow, as soon as tomorrow, based on your approval, to make certain that our community is duly aware of the enrollment freeze that we're recommending on tonight for Chapin Elementary School. With that, I will conclude and try to respond to any questions you might have.
Dr. Harris, before we take questions, I'd like to entertain a motion,
Certainly.
and then our questions will probably be directed to you also. So first, I'd like to entertain a motion regarding the enrollment freeze shown as Phase 2 that we've just been briefed on. Do I have a motion? Mr. Cates.
Mr. Chair, I move that we give,
Just approval.
that we approve the enrollment freeze Phase 2 as just presented.
Do we have a second? Ms. Hutchison seconds. And that brings us to our questions. Mr. Cates, I'll go back to you first since you made the motion. Let you pose the first
So,
question.
Dr. Harris, just as possibly a fourth bullet point on the slide, transfer schools of choice, those are the three schools that Valentine, Dutch Fork, and River Springs. But while you were giving that presentation, it did come to mind that actually any school open to choice, that's currently open to choice, or a magnet that they were selected into through the lottery process would also be an option. I think if we listed that as a fourth option, we would just have to be clear that transportation would not be included, because my understanding is if they do school of choice, that transportation is responsibility of the family rather than the district. But that is always an option through some of our excellent schools that are open to choice or other magnet programs that may be of interest to those families.
That's a very good point, Mr. Cates, and I certainly be glad and look forward to adding that because we do have and have had, and I'm sure we'll continue to have, persons from outside of School District 5 who will claim residence and provide the necessary proofs of residence and meet the deadline for the application for either choice or a magnet program. So absolutely, I think that's a great suggestion to include that as a fourth option.
And Dr. Melton would like to add some comments.
Mr. Cates, we appreciate you catching that because, of course, choice is still normalizing in School District 5. So as Dr. Harris said, transportation is a part of it, but I'd like to remind the board and also the community with our Discover 5 magnet grant that we are currently using, transportation is provided to our new Discover 5 schools. That includes H.E. Corley Elementary, that includes Nursery Road Elementary, and that includes Leap Heart Elementary. So we don't want to confuse the community of how to add that fourth bullet without confusing that, but Discover 5 schools do offer transportation as a part of that grant, which would not be at the expense of School District 5. That goes with the grant obligations.
Good point. Mr. Levis, I'm coming to you. Mr. Harris, I just wanted to say, before we get into any detailed questions, that we appreciate you bringing this back. I know we had this discussion and approval last year. We asked you to keep us apprised of what's going on, and this shouldn't be a surprise to any of us. We're continuing to grow. You gave us a very good graphic of how that happens. So thank you all for being on top of it and realizing that we need to take some action now to help our families and help us move forward.
Thank you.
Mr. Lovelace.
Okay, from the district's report, I think I have these numbers right. In 2018, the Valentine Elementary School has a capacity of 819 students. Is that correct?
I'm not sure.
Okay, I'm looking at the School District 5 of Lexington and Richland County School Building Information, last 10 years, table 21, page 1 of 3.
Is that in the audit? Is that?
What is that?
I'm not sure what.
I think he's looking at the same.
I got this information from the audit, from what we
From
did.
the audit.
Okay, so we've got a capacity
Okay.
at Valentine Elementary School of 819 children. We've got from the 45-day enrollment, we've got 617. That means we've got a excess capacity of 202 students right now at Valentine. All right, following the same logic, we've got from Chapin Elementary, we've got 916 student capacity right now, according to the 45-day information you handed out. I think it's 853.
According to the 45-day, it was,
That's correct.
that is correct, 853.
853, that gives us excess capacity at Chapin of 63 students right now. All right, Lake Murray Elementary has a capacity of 849, and from this information you gave us, it's 924 students right now at Lake Murray. So that's we're over supplied with students right now. So my question to you is, if we've got some excess capacity at Chapin, and we don't have excess capacity here, but we've got it at Ballantyne, why are we not moving students that live closer to the Ballantyne school from here, rather than moving students that live 7 miles away over to Ballantyne? Why are we doing that? Why would we propose to do that if we have excess capacity there and these students over here live closer to it? You just put a diagram up there which showed dots. Those dots indicate outliers, and most of the outliers are in the Chapin area. Most of the population is around this school.
Dr. Harris, may I go first if you don't mind?
Sure.
And then whatever void I may have, you fill in the
Yeah,
blanks for me. How
I
about
have
that?
one. Absolutely.
Mr. Lovelace, I regret we didn't have the report that you're referencing. If you'll note that for us, if you'll say it once again, I'm gonna ask Ms. Towers to capture that so we can go back and look at where you're looking. So I heard you say you're looking at the audit report that we distributed the last board meeting. Is that accurate?
I got this off of the district website, so, I mean, from a long time ago, but I have it here if you would
Okay,
like it.
that will be
It's-
helpful.
It's on our, so you can make a copy of it. But anyway,
That will be helpful for us to know when you downloaded it, because if it's accurate and up to date, we need to make sure we have that. If it's out of date, some of the information may have changed. If it was in the last audit that Ms. Richardson had presented at Crossroads, we certainly have that easily accessible. But all that to say, we didn't know that was going to be a question for this evening, so I regret Dr. Harris wasn't prepared for that. So Dr. Harris, let's put a pause on that and check that. But let me answer some of Mr. Lovelace's question, and then you follow and fill in the
Sure.
blanks if you would.
well, wait a minute. What are the capacities if that's not the case? We should know that.
Well, let her answer the question, because that's part of the answer.
So our capacity by board policies, we like for elementary schools to be around 750. But of course, we look to see the staffing, we look at the available seats, we look to see what cohort may be larger or smaller than another, and then we also look to see what intervention services we offer to students. We look to see what special education programs we offer to students. So when Mr. Giuliano and Dr. Slatton work to place our special education programs, if you think about a special education self-contained class, it may actually house, on average, 6 to 8 students. But that takes a full classroom that would, on average, could host 18 to 25 elementary school students. So thus, we have a capacity issue. We have a classroom that could house 24 students, but instead we choose to opt to go with special needs children that may have 6 or 8 or up to 12, depending on the classification of the students. We prefer, of course, to have students in the space that is safe rather than portables. So if you talk about capacity, it depends upon the program of where things are. Mr. Giuliano and Dr. Slatton have worked very diligently to make sure that our students with special needs are housed closer to home. At one point, just a few years ago, actually during the previous Chief of Instruction's tenure, we had students, for the community, that used to be me, if you didn't know, we had students that traveled across this community to go into certain schools, so we removed them from their community, and they and their families could not be a part of a school family nor a school community. Instead, they were transported elsewhere. So I think that's important for us to pause to make sure that there's context for the community. The graphic that Dr. Harris showed earlier, he and Mr. Holden worked on that to make sure that we could give you a visual. And I hope everyone heard him say this is by reassignment, not by default. In School District 5, we've worked hard to make sure that every choice is a great choice. We've worked hard to make sure that families understood you have a choice in this district. You're not assigned, because we know that when a child is assigned, that can leave a parent to say, but I really wanted to go there.
Right.
So there's that an immediate void of I wanted to be where I was, and now I can't go there because of the numbers. So our plan of bringing forth tonight to you, we're trying to offer more schools in addition to what Mr. Cates mentioned earlier, which is actually more than 3, but we're trying to offer choice to families so that when they come in, we can make sure that families have a choice and a recommendation of what's best aligned with their work schedule, with their work route, if they would like to be involved with the school communities, but also what instructional programs may they want their child to be involved with. So I think all that's important for us to paint the picture. We could easily get caught up in being numbers people, but we want to make sure that we're focused on students and programming and what is right for School District 5 and our operations. Dr. Harris, I have forgotten something, so tell me what I forgot that may help make sure this group understands.
Well, you did well, and I would only offer just a point of reiteration of what you did say, and that is based on the capacity number. Basically, the capacity is based on how the school has been used, and we just heard that very well articulated explanation as to that. So I'm very interested in that because I have something different, and so I'm very interested in seeing what you have, particularly looking at the year in which that was produced, because again, capacity is really based on how it's been used, and I would just simply follow suit with the explanation that we just heard from Dr. Melton.
Mr. Lovelace, do you mind giving a copy of that to Katrina or Sybil, and maybe they could just take a photo of it on their phone since we don't have capability of Xerox right here?
This shows from 2009, the capacity at Valentine was 800, and then in 2010, all the way through 2018, it changed to 819 students. So it did change.
Was that capacity or was that actual enrollment?
The capacity has the square footage, the capacity, and the enrollment, the enrollment for each year from 2009 all the way through 2018.
Okay, thank you. If you don't mind, they can take a picture of it and then take a look at it and then come back with an answer.
And Ms. Hutchinson, if I may add, that
Yes.
is when we moved autistic programs to Ballantyne Elementary. Prior to that date, we did not have as many self-contained or special education programs there as we do now. So I suspect when we have a chance to review that, one of the factors we likely will identify will be the creation of programs to make sure that Oak Point wasn't the only school in School District 5 that offered autistic programs to our elementary school students.
Thank you for that clarification. Okay, I think I saw Ms. Hammond first.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Harris, I have two. One is about transportation. Did I get this right? It was 57% from the freeze from from a year ago, used the district transportation.
That is correct.
And is it open to everyone? Do the parents decide if they want to use it or not?
That's correct. It's an optional opportunity for them to utilize transportation. Many of them, the others, have opted to take their children to and from school.
Right. And I guess, Mr. Richardson, we just kind of have to guess about does it add a lot with the funds for the bus? I mean, you just kind of I was just thinking about budgeting that because we really don't know how many are going to choose that or not. I just want to be sure that, that's an option for parents because I'm glad we are offering that because I think that's important.
And I don't know if you've met Mr. Wiseman, our transportation director, but he
Yeah,
does a really good job with determining all that.
Don't mess with his butt. I got you. All right, my other question is different, but I just want to be sure I was right, that the transportation is optional, and then we have that in our budget. Now, I need to understand, the three schools you put for the transfer schools of choice, they're Ballantyne, Dutch Fork, and River Springs. Even though Ballantyne is closed to school of choice, it's open to the freeze. Now, what's our reasoning for that? I mean, not that I think you're wrong, but I'd like to know if it's closed, say to the public, and we've had that out there, but yet we open it it's special to the freeze people.
My statement was that it has heretofore been closed to the school of choice, and so we have opted to, again, in 16-17, open it up to, as a first wave for voluntary enrollment. There was some space there, and of course, following suit with having it part of the freeze. So heretofore, giving you just some historical data about Ballantyne Elementary, that it has been closed. However, you're absolutely right. We are opening it based on availability of space. All of this, all three schools are going to be based on availability of space, which is why I made mention of the fact that we'll continue to monitor this regularly so that if, in fact, we need to, we would come back to you with more information or an additional recommendation.
Well, I wondered, too, if it was because Ballantyne was so geographically, attainable from the Lake Murray area. But to me, Dutch Fork, I don't know the exact mileage, but Dutch Fork Elementary or River Springs that we picked, to me, would be further for those people in the area that are going to be affected by the freeze.
That is correct, and I think my response to that is, it's why I think the optional transportation, as you mentioned earlier, is going to be very, very helpful. And I think also for those families who are commuting from the Chapin area to the downtown area to others, I think River Springs and Dutch Fork offers an option that's not too far off the grid, if you will, in terms of getting the students, should they choose to transport them themselves.
And then one last one, if anybody has, I think I remember this from the other presentation, if you are living there and you have siblings that are already at whatever school, they would not be affected by the freeze because that family's already there and the children are already established.
As long as they reside
They
prior
abide.
to the start date, then they're safe, yes.
And do you have, I mean, is there, what's your plan if you are going to watch those numbers you said so that no one of these got more than the capacity and the class size would be affected? I mean, you'll kind of monitor as this freeze takes on and somebody says where they want to go. It might be even the person that has to choose another school might have to choose a different one if it's already more than you think is good for that school.
That's exactly right. We're going to look at this as we've done over the first phase, and we'll continue to look at that, all of these schools, and they will be monitored very regularly, and we want to be very mindful of the board's policy regarding class size. So we're keeping that in mind at all times, so you're absolutely right. Hence is another reason why there's more than just one additional choice. So should a class or a grade level fill up, then there are at least two more choices. Based on tonight's recommendation that we're going to follow suit with, there will be additional choices should they choose for a magnet program and or an
Right,
additional school of
Mr.
choice option.
Mr. Kate said, and
Right.
Dr. Milton said so eloquently, there are a lot of other schools other than
Right.
these. But did we, my last one, did we have, just if you look at the implementation for the last year, would you share with us the biggest problem you saw to the freeze, even though it's something we need? Is there a place we need to work more on as we implemented a second year? And did most of the families get their first choice after they had to not go, they couldn't go where the freeze was on?
I would tell you, Ms. Hammond, I would not stand here and tell you that there were just major problems with the first implementation. I certainly don't consider it problems. Obviously, communication, and then more communication is going to be key. It was then, it is now. I think we certainly have a better plan to make sure that we're communicating effectively and efficiently with all of our community. In terms of, at this point, I don't know that can single out a particular one issue that just stands out to say this was a problem. It was about making certain that our internal staff and individual schools, Lake Murray in particular, the schools that were receiving the students, Valentine and Chapin, were duly aware, duly informed of the information, duly informed of what options they had and what to share with families. That was the key issue that I saw. And we had enough staff and ample staff to make certain that we pressed our point and made certain that they were duly aware of all of that. Yes, there were questions, but anything new obviously dictates that there are going to be several questions. We responded to those. I responded to it. My office responded to it. The schools were in a position, the registrars, the principals, administrative staff were in a position to respond to those questions as they came about. And I would tell you, not long after the implementation were fewer questions. So I can't stand here and tell you that there is any one thing that are just super problematic. I just think it's our responsibility to be as effective and efficient in making certain that our community is duly aware. Therein lies what we need to do.
So most of them got the school that they chose after the one they couldn't, that was frozen.
They
got
did,
control.
they did.
Dr. Belton, I think you want to add something,
I
please?
would, if you wouldn't mind. Ms. Hammond, thank you for your questions, because it gives me a great opportunity. I like to credit Dr. Harris and his team. They have been on top of watching these numbers since January of 2018, because, of course, the first discussion about this was December of 2017. So Dr. Harris and his team have taken on something that's brand new for School District 5 and monitored it. I see Ms. Graham up at the top. Obviously, she's very interested in monitoring enrollment to make sure that we have accurate information, and she's one of the many key players involved with this entire process. Ms. Hammond, the question you asked about timing, we've noticed a pattern between now and the end of the year. We typically have seen a slowdown in the trend of enrollment because our families are moving more during the summer, the spring of the year, or during the semester break or the holiday break, we would call it. So Dr. Harris and his team have predicted, although we've already shown some changes in that pattern, that the month of January is a little faster speed than what it's been. So we would like to get to the point that this could be seasonal, to say we can predict by this quarter or this month that we're going to expect a higher number of this freeze. But notice this is phase 2. So anytime you start numbering something, there's typically further numbers to follow. So our commitment to the board is that he and his team will continue to follow. I see Mr. Hutchison here from Chapin Elementary tonight. His School Improvement Council had lots of questions about this last week because, of course, they see the car rider grid and they see the long lines there. But our families are seeing that this works. But the reason it's worked is because of communications and because of Dr. Harris working with our real estate agents to make sure that those who have purchased come in with their eyes wide open. Instead of surprised, you're going to not get your choice because of where you decided to purchase. So we're going to continue our partnership with the real estate community to make sure they know how to list appropriately and that we're communicating and they're receiving our communication. So hopefully that'll bring a little bit of comfort to all of you.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Mr. Cates.
I want to revisit the question of capacity. Dr. Harris and Dr. Melton, please don't let me veer too far off from accurate statements here. When we considered this the first time, that was a key concern of mine, that are we using the capacity that we have at various schools? And what I discovered, and without going back and producing the document that I did for myself, that in the education vernacular, y'all have a lot of ways to describe what sounds like the same thing, but they're radically different. When you talk about building capacity, maybe 10, 15 years ago, the math was square footage divided by a factor per student, and that was how you determined how many students you could put in that building, and that was called capacity or building capacity. As we moved forward and as we're at a place where we have outstanding choice in our district, we started to look at what is referred to as program capacity, where the programming of the school actually determines the capacity of the number of students. And that just because the original building capacity method, which was kind of simple math, programming capacity is not quite that simple, because you're looking at the students, the programs, and the options that are held within there. And then the other thing I remember was just because that's not confusing enough, y'all also talk about core capacity, which looks at things like cafeteria and gymnasium and the ability to move students. You know, we have made a commitment as a board to two things that I think help keep us in the excellent performance and position that our students are in, and that is school size and class size. While we could house more students in a building, we're not in the business of housing students. We're in business of educating those students in ways that challenge them and meet their needs. So if there's a way to describe capacity, yet again, I'm sure y'all will come up with another way to do it and call it capacity, but it's not really the same thing. Did I describe all that accurately?
Mr. Cates, you get an A for tonight, for sure.
Well, I had never had many of those, so I'll take it.
A+, as a matter of fact. You're exactly right. There's a difference in warehousing in terms of how many bodies you can put into a facility versus how a facility is being used. And program capacity is pretty much what drives school districts, and based on programs that are being offered throughout the schools. And therein lies, I think you're absolutely right, the difference in what those numbers might say to us.
And just to finish that point, and I'll be done, is sometimes we're asked to produce numbers that would indicate total capacity when we know that that's not our ideal capacity or program capacity, because either through a federal program or a state program, they provide for us the formula that says, here's how you calculate capacity, now report how much capacity you have at school A, B, C, and D. And it does not take into consideration always those special programs and special needs of our students. So sometimes, and we had this conversation when we were looking at some of these numbers, because even on our own website, we used capacity in 2 or 3 different ways, and we were deliberate to clean that up. So I think we recognized in our own communication, sometimes we were creating some of the confusion about capacity, and have gone back and kind of zeroed in on what is our program capacity. We don't want to start lunch at 10 and end it at 2. So we've recognized some challenges in today's environment that may not have existed at another time.
Mr. White, and then Mr. Lovelace be up.
Yeah, I wanted to add a couple of things. First is the fact that we're going into phase 2 of a freeze is all the more reason to move forward with this new school as expeditiously as possible and not delay that in any manner, because ultimately the new school is going to be the one that what relieves this overcrowding. Michael, I think you summed that up very well. I mean, I can remember very clearly as we were trying to pass referendums, and by the way, we did adopt a unanimous board. It was very politically divided. We adopted unanimously the class size policy, the school size policy. You don't want kids in 800, 900, 1,000 kids in a school, particularly at the elementary level. And one of the things that we got into years of debates was capacity of schools. And people would get architectural plans, and they'd find a number here, and they'd find a number there. And this concept of program capacity began to emerge, and explaining why you have certain schools with certain requirements. But at the end of the day, we're not about just numbers, putting in there people in there. And I think that what I learned from that whole process, there was one superintendent, and this crossed several superintendents as we were trying to get this referendum passed. But one superintendent finally took, because there was a crowd of people, and some of them are still the same people criticizing everything we do, and walked some of these schools. And they were doing this square footage thing and calculating and publishing all these things, saying, why don't you put this, that, and there. And they finally figured out they were counting closet space, unusable space. So when you do this one-dimensional look from outsiders, people that aren't in these schools all day long and live and breathe with your full-time positions about what the needs are, what the kids are doing, what's going on in those schools. And the takeaway from that is, if you're not involved in these schools, you're not an administrator, you're not living or breathing it, you don't have the ability to make these kind of decisions, particularly looking at one-dimensional analysis of numbers. One of the reasons Ballantyne was not chosen to rezone, we could have rezoned, and I can tell you every rezoning I've been involved in, somebody's unhappy. The rezonings are particularly susceptible to the political side. People want to go in there and they want to oust people off the board, and they abuse parents and they abuse families. And I can't tell you how many times I've sat and watched a room full of red-faced parents just being angry as they could be because the political people on the board had gone out in the neighborhoods and said, they don't have to do this, we're trying to stop this, when there was one recommendation. It was done very thoughtfully and scientifically by the people, the administrators here. So I personally don't like rezonings, particularly in this community, because they are abused by people that want to engage in the politics. And that abuses families, and that affects kids, and that is more than just us sitting up here counting numbers. Ballantyne was not chosen for rezoning when we did this hiring freeze for a very simple reason. There's going to be a band of families that Dr. Hefner explained would get rezoned down into Ballantyne, and they get whipsawed and they get rezoned right back as Ballantyne begins to grow. That area is not going to stay dormant. And again, we need the people that live and breathe this and do this all day long, who have their fingers on the pulse of what's going on in this community and in these schools and with these families to make these recommendations and not be done in this sort of one-dimensional, mechanical number way by people, including board members, who don't understand this. The cafeteria stuff was always a concern. My kids were in a school, in elementary school, where we were fighting a rezoning, and the people on this board were opposing a rezoning. My kids were having their art classroom in a hallway at River Springs until the fire marshal shut it down. They had language teachers moving around on carts, and we had to fight tooth and nails and it was me and Mr. Gant in a divided board, and Mr. Gant was in the hospital seconding my motions as we were fighting to get the rezoning done, along with, Oak Point Elementary, the final approval, so the relief, the real relief could be granted. And it's something that you've got to make these hard decisions. Now, the freeze is something new. There's people that are unhappy with that, but they're going to be unhappy if there was a rezoning. The other thing is teachers appreciate school-size policies and class-size policies. And when we're in a competitive market with limited funds, they will come to work in these schools as opposed to overcrowded schools in other districts. That is a benefit to our students, it's a benefit to our teachers, and it's a benefit to our families. The one thing I would ask of you, and I did hear, and I'm approaching this delicate topic of rezoning because it's so abused in this community. I did hear from one of my partners who lives in the Chapin community, who has kids in the schools, K through 12 schools, that there's a lot of concern about where everybody's ultimately going to reside. And his request was, and this doesn't need to be board members out doing this, but maybe the district have some general guidelines from Amix Ferry, the new school we're putting there, to Lake Murray, to Chapin, to Ballantyne, where communities are ultimately going to reside. That seems to be an overarching concern, particularly when they're trying to sell homes, because this whole thing gets, again, abused. Oh, it's the board's fault my house can't sell. But had we done a rezoning, we'd have a whole host of other people mad, and there's no way to make everybody happy. And we've moved forward with this freeze, and again, the answer is we need to build this school as quick as we can to solve this problem. And until we solve it, it's going to be a problem, and it's going to be an issue at some level.
Thank you, Mr. White. Mr. Lovelace.
Okay. We're talking about one-dimensionalism and all this here, and we're talking about math and so forth. Well, we're looking at a capacity difference of 202 people, 202 students at Ballantyne Elementary. That's not semantics. That has nothing to do with federal law or anything else. That has to do with the capacity that's right over here next to us, and we're going to take people from Chapin and move them all the way over here and have to get up earlier in the mornings and do things like that. That is a disruption to those people in our community. We're also looking at building a new school, which we all realize was voted on Amix Ferry. The cohort from 0 to 4 in 2016 has 147 students from the Amix Ferry corridor on it. The cohort from 2016 of age 5 to 9 has 208 students in it. So we're going to be moving students. If you build a 750 capacity school there, whatever you want to call it, it's not semantics. We're going to be moving over 550 kids from one of our corridors to another. We're not talking about where, and the other thing about this is if you start a student over here at Ballantyne that lives 7 miles away, and his siblings and all are going to want to go to the same school and all that, that's not going to end in just a year. That's going to go on for a while. So, the disruption for the people going the other way with all this traffic and so forth is going to be extensive. And we need to understand that if you took the people from this school and moved them over there, which is closer, then you'd have a better situation. Not people that live all the way out here on these peninsulas off Lexington Highway and Amix Ferry. So one way or the other, we're moving people a long way that we didn't have to do had we built the school over there on Derrick's Pond Road, Derrick's Pond proper. And that was what we should have done.
Mr. Lovelace, I appreciate your comments. One thing I'd like to say for the future for the whole board, if you're going to quote numbers and audits, it'd be great for our staff to get that ahead of time and be prepared to answer those questions. We started off, I think you had audit numbers. We had some things supplied to us tonight, but it'd be nice to all be on the same sheet of music. And that's just something that I offer to the whole board. If you have questions, you can get that ahead of time to somebody, they'll be prepared to answer it. Dr. Harris, I apologize tonight for you to get blindsided with that. But, Mr. Levis, what you've just voiced is your opinion, in my opinion. So,
But these
you're just
numbers I
speaking
got
for a
from
lot of
Lexington
people
County.
saying that they would be better off being rezoned. We know that one thing, we don't have enough capacity for the students that are in this area. This is the recommendation of the professionals that guide this district, and I think we have to respect that. Mr. Cates.
I have one question and one request. I'll start with the request. I would like to see a policy brought forward for the board that would put some triggers in, some benchmarks in that might trigger this type of action rather than waiting and it being more of a reflective process. Dr. Melton, does that make sense? So that the board by policy would create that policy that would give you some guidance and direction in the future when this happens, so that you don't have to almost start over each time. And I would welcome a policy brought to us that could help you with that. We'll be happy to assist in that. And the question I have is, Dr. Harris, the map you showed us with the purple dots shows me that we're not moving anyone. We're not forcibly telling folks where they have to go, that they have a choice based on their preference up to the point where we have to say that that's full. That at times we talk about reassigning or moving or making someone, folks still have choices beyond their zone school. We recognize that their probably preferred choice would be go to the school that historically their homes have been zoned for, but you're really not making the decision on who goes where. As is our habit in our district, we want to celebrate the choices that our families and our students have.
I think you're absolutely right. That's exactly what we've tried to do here, and certainly look forward to continue doing, is making choice available in as many schools as we possibly can. We're certainly guided by choice, and I think it's very family-friendly, and we want to continue in that regard. I've not assigned anyone to any one particular school. However, I will say that I will continue to make certain that as we watch and monitor enrollment, that where and when classes or in particular grade levels are full or are filled to capacity, then certainly I make that known, and I will, we basically take them off as in terms of options at that particular time. So we'll continue to do that, should this move forward, and I look forward to doing so.
Dr. Harris, I realize you've been at the podium there about 45 minutes. You're welcome to sit down. I don't know if we have any real questions. Mr. White, is there a question that you have?
No, I had
Dr.
another
Harris?
comment
question?
for the
A
board.
comment, a brief comment?
Yeah, brief comment.
Brief comment, okay. Dr. Harris, why don't you
Okay.
take a seat,
Yeah,
and
he
I
can
can
have a
ask
seat.
you from there.
I do want to point out one thing for Mr. Lovelace. These decisions, the solution to this is going to occur in 2 years when we get the Amos Ferry School open. These school sites are 100-year decisions or forever. These schools are going to be here longer than any of us are going to be here. The decision was made by this board, and this isn't the purpose of tonight's discussion to revet this. It was done extensively. The Amex Ferry site is a better site. The other site was not constructible. You have your opinion too, Ms. Hammond, but you had your vote and you had your opportunity to persuade people, and the board voted differently. And the superintendent that was in here at the time recommended something differently. We can all have different opinions, but that decision is done. The reality is there is no school that was built 2 years ago, and it wasn't because of the site that we didn't get started. There were other reasons that progressed to where we are today. But the reality is it's going to be a growing pain for some parts of the community, but the long-term solution was there needed to be a school in that quadrant, that area of the community. And I can tell you from serving on this board since we started this first referendum, we built the Spring Hill and the Cates Center directly across the street from the first piece of property that this board was considering. And for political reasons, that property and that decision was pushed away, and we spent a lot more money buying property with different superintendents and different administrators because that was the best location. And because the early board could not act proactively, we ended up spending a lot more, and that's what's going to happen here. Eventually, there will be a school built in that quadrant had we not made that decision, and it will cost a whole lot more in the future. And the reality is we've got 2 years to a solution, and we got to work through it, but we've got a solution. This board's already approved.
Thank you. We've had great discussion. Dr. Harris, thank you for bringing the information on the enrollment freeze Phase 2. We've had a motion, we've had a second, we've had a great discussion about it, and I'd now like to entertain that we take a vote. All those in favor of the motion to approve the enrollment freeze Phase 2, please raise your hand. Okay. And all those opposed, please raise your hand. That's 6 for, 1 against. You get that, Ms. Towers? And that brings us to our discussion agenda